Well, hello and welcome to the Sacred Path School podcast number 7. Okay, so this is obviously, as I said, podcast number 7. So we've been through quite a lot of stuff in the last 6 podcasts, and what I want to do in this one is just actually, I suppose, recap with some of the main points about the story so far, about what we've covered so far before we move on to what are we going to do about it. All right, so let's go right back to the beginning, and just to, I suppose, refresh what the purpose of this podcast is and the whole idea of the Sacred Path School and that sort of stuff. So Sacred Path School, and the reason why I started the Sacred Path School is that in pretty much every, I suppose, spiritual or religious teaching, it teaches that there's a path of ascension that you can walk in life. So a path that basically spirals upwards so that you get better in some way, that you ascend in some way on the path that you're on. And that's really the definition of a sacred path. So the idea of a Sacred Path School is really about trying to, I suppose, encourage the discussion around like how you would actually, what a sacred path looks like and how you would actually do that. And then obviously also to look at, tools for actually walking that path. And so what I've been trying to do in the first few sessions of this podcast is really basically to lay down a framework to understand the sacred path and some of the questions you might ask to walk that path. And my intention is that probably got, as I said, we've done 6 of these. This is number 7, which is going to sort of consolidate where we're at. Then I'm going to look really specifically at what to actually do about some of these things. So how you actually create change in your life. And then we should probably take another, I shouldn't say how many because it might change, but we'll take a few more of these sessions. And then what I want to do is actually start talking to people of, I suppose, various walks of life and pulling apart their views on life and how they are actually attempting to walk a sacred path. So that's my intention with this, so just to clarify that. All right, so let's just go back. So if you remember going back to the very first one of these podcasts, which if you haven't listened to it, as I said, I recommend that you do go back and start at the beginning and sort of come up to speed with this. So what I propose to you is that there's 3 big questions that you can ask. So who am I? Why am I here? And how do I lead a good life? And in answering those questions, what I propose is that what you actually need to understand is the nature of existence, which is existential philosophy, the nature of reality, and as I said, you should really have a look at quantum physics and various teachings around that, and also the nature of ourselves, which is the reason why I'm digging into neurocognitive science and basically looking at what are we working with in terms of how do our brains work, etc. And I introduced to you the model for existential alignment. So remember, or hopefully you recall that from an existential philosophy perspective, the key relationship to dig into is between being and time. So understanding that over time, our states of being change. And if we want to be able to dig into the nature of reality and how we are creating our reality, then it's worthwhile to dig into that relationship between being and time and to understand how, like I just said, how that changes over time. So you might remember past, present, future. So I suppose the sort of 3 main domains of time. We're ignoring sort of 4th dimension type stuff. But anyway, and that most of us are basically cycling back around the past, present loop and doing that the majority of the time. So majority of the time, essentially, we're pattern matching. And what we want to try and do is to be more intentional in the way that we are living our lives. So be more intentional about what we're creating. And you might remember that what I said at the time is that when you go through that model, there's some key questions that you need to answer, because those key questions provide a foundation which you're building your understanding of life, or on that foundation. So you need to understand what that foundation is made of. So the first question to ask is what your belief is between free will and destiny, because that's going to affect quite dramatically like how you see a good life, etc. And then to go back and understand what your sort of dominant world paradigm, like how the world works, like what you were taught from your parents and significant others as you were growing up, the stories that you tell about who you are, and then to be able to start picking that apart. And what I propose to you with the existential alignment model is that ideally what you want to be doing is aligning the three aspects of self. So in the future, you've got your aspirational being. So it's really about dreams and visions and also values. In the present moment is the free being. So this is really about choices and remembering that we can't take our freedom for granted because we're subject to perceptual priming, so influenced by the world. So we need to do activities to enable us to be as present as possible. And then in the past, you've got the constructed being. So the constructed being is really about stories, and it's really interpretive stories to understand the experiences that you've already had. So if you think about it, we have aspirations or dreams, which by definition live in the future. And then we have an experience in the present moment, and then the present becomes the past, and we tell a story about that. And what I propose to you is that from an existential perspective, ideally what you want to be doing is lining those three things up so that you don't have a level of internal conflict between what you're trying to create in the world and maybe the story that you're telling about it. The other important thing to note with that existential alignment model is that time effectively goes backwards. So in other words, the future becomes the present, which then becomes the past. So the flow of time is important because that has significant implications for how you interpret or how you react to your belief around free will versus destiny. Because if you believe in destiny, so if you believe in destiny or fate, or that in some way your life is already set, then time basically is going forward. So in other words, you're going past, present, future. But if you believe in complete free will, then obviously the future hasn't been written yet and it's coming towards you. Most of us believe in like a balance between the two. But again, the important thing is to actually ask that question so you can pull that apart and you can understand how that influences some of the other questions that we're going to ask, or we've already asked down the track. Then in the second podcast, we looked at Jean-Paul Sartre's idea of my life as a project. So Sartre is basically saying that he saw each individual as a project because everyone actively works to build their identity through their actions and commitments throughout their life. So basically what he's saying is that our identity is always constantly evolving. And so you've got to be able to imagine what's possible and obviously do stuff about it. And it's useful to think of your life as a project because then that allows you to, I suppose, actively put resources behind it, etc. Some of the concepts we talked about in that second podcast again. So these are fundamental concepts from both Jean-Paul Sartre and Martin Heidegger. So Martin Heidegger, I would suggest you, is probably the key person in existential philosophy. And just some of the key concepts were nothingness, so the idea of an absence of being. Freedom, so that's the ability to create our reality. And I'd suggest to you that I suppose the key aim of existential philosophy is to find freedom. And from an existential perspective, it's really about freedom from them. And them is really anybody who's told you what you're capable of doing in life or who you are or anything like that. So that's going to influence what you then believe is possible. And so from an existential perspective, true freedom is to be free of them. Choice, and it's important here. So it was choice and its position before logic. So logic will basically hold you in that past-present loop. So logic will hold you in the past because logic by definition, and don't argue with me, you could argue about this, but anyway, logic by definition really requires to be able to draw on evidence. So you're building a logical, rational argument, and almost by definition, that's really based in the past. And what Heidegger in particular is saying is that choice comes before logic. So choose before you start actually rationalising what's going on or what your choice is. Authenticity and the idea of striving towards it. Intentionality. So again, we talk quite a lot about intentionality, the whole idea of being clear about what your intention is. Action as intentional and authentic, and angst. So angst is the uncertainty that leaves us with anxiety about the future. And the idea of existentialism really is to be able to, I suppose, sit in that realm or that feeling of uncertainty and not completely freak out. So in other words, not buy into the whole angst about it, but enable you just to sit in it, and again to start to make choices without having to go into logic or justify them. So the key position of existentialism is that we create our reality through the choices that we make and the way in which we act upon these choices. So the authentic being acts from a position of freedom and with pure intent. So pure intent, in other words, free of them. We then moved on to podcast number 3. So we looked at the implications of worldviews and stories. That's the whole idea of them. The fact that the brain wants to be right. So see how we're crossing over here into neurocognitive science. So we're saying, okay, that's lovely philosophical type stuff, existential stuff, but what happens in reality? What are we dealing with in terms of the way our brain works? And what we're dealing with is a brain that basically wants to make sense of the world. Right, so you need to make sense of the world. If you can't make sense of the world, almost by definition, you're going to have a level of insanity, because you have that level of, I suppose, freaking out, for want of a better description. But the problem is that in the brain, or in your brain, my brain, is that once you've actually decided on something, so once you've told an interpretive story about something, the brain wants to be right. So even if that interpretive story is negative for you, right, the brain still wants to be right about it, and so the brain's going to pay attention to evidence, if you like, or information that supports the fact that that story is right, and it's going to dismiss all evidence that, I suppose, questions or calls into question that story. So it's an important thing to recognise, because you can get trapped in ways of thinking that you can be convinced are perfectly rational and logical and supported by evidence. But unfortunately, what you're doing is you're just paying attention to all the stuff that supports your view. And so see how that goes back to that concept I was talking about a minute ago, about choice coming before logic, right? So choice comes before logic. We also talked about the whole idea of being and becoming, so that we're always becoming something. So the whole idea of movement, and that's very different to the idea of sort of analysing the world and having a fixed view on the world. So we've got to be much more free and be able to move. The idea of experimentation and play, so being willing to play around with things and understanding that there's certain things that you aren't going to understand until your level of consciousness has changed. Right, so understand that you might have a way of understanding the world now where you think that things are a certain way, but you can't even understand the next level of consciousness until you've actually evolved. Talk quite a bit about values as well. So values as aspirations, and the whole idea of head, heart, hand. And so ideally, I suppose by now really, and through the sort of podcast, should have done a bit of work to identify what your values are and what's most important in your life and how they guide your life. So head, heart, hand with values is about that we are intellectually convinced of the worthiness of values. We feel them in our heart, and then we need to put them into action through our hands. And then finally in that podcast, we also talked about defining moments and the implications for belief. So defining moments are those moments in our lives where we've had to make like really tough decisions. So tough decisions between right and right. And it's kind of like a fork in the road type scenario. And what happens in those defining moments, so how we behave in those defining moments actually influences what we subsequently believe is possible in the world. So it's important, again, to identify the defining moments in your life and to actually go through and work out what did you actually learn from that and how has that influenced what you now believe is possible. Because remember, with the flow of time, so remember time is going future from an existential perspective, future, present, past, right? And so when you have defining moments, then it can create like baggage that you carry along in the past, which, as I said, influences what you then believe is possible for the future. So it's worthwhile digging into that. We went on to podcast 4. So we talked a bit more about values and about ethics. So we talked about the whole idea that a value is not a value unless you're willing to pay a price to uphold it. And some of the examples, certainly that have guided my life, but some of the key examples of that would be Martin Luther King Jr., who stood up for civil rights in America in the 60s and ended up costing him his life. Muhammad Ali, Cassie's claim, Muhammad Ali, obviously very, very well-known, very, very famous world heavyweight boxer who refused to go to Vietnam, refused to be conscripted and go to Vietnam, and he was stripped of his world boxing title and couldn't box for a number of years. So a value isn't a value unless you're willing to pay a price to uphold it. So it's easy to talk about values, but it's very different to put them into action and pay that price. We started talking about ethics. So ethics and the whole idea of ethics being about answering the question of how ought we to live, or how do you lead a good life? And one of the key questions to ask there in building that is, what is your belief about whether people are inherently good or bad? Because that's going to have a very big influence on how you resolve ethical dilemmas and also how you treat other people. We looked at normative ethical theories. So the idea of answering the question of how ought we to live by answering the 3 feeder questions. So the first one was what's right, so right and wrong in terms of principles and values. What's good in terms of outcomes, and what's culturally fitting. And understanding that over time the culturally fitting stuff changes as the world changes. Talked about ethical decision making, so the idea of okay, how do you actually resolve ethical dilemmas? I suppose we challenged the idea that it was a rational, logical process by understanding that there's 3 things that mess up your thinking, and those 3 things were whether or not you have to make contact. So in other words, if you actually have to like touch someone or actually make physical contact with somebody, it changes the way you think about it. Whether or not it's personal or impersonal, so you're going to act differently if you're dealing with somebody you have a personal relationship with. And the third one was that history matters. So the things that have gone before influence what's going to happen next. We then went on to the 5th podcast. So we looked at why good people do bad things, which, so this was a subject of my PhD thesis, my doctoral thesis a few years ago. And basically where I got to with it was I'd been writing about this stuff and teaching ethics for about a long time. How long, let me think about it. But probably almost 20 years anyway. And I started really questioning whether or not what we were doing is actually making any difference. And so I started doing my PhD on exactly that question. Does ethics education make any difference? And quite quickly I found about 30 odd years of research that indicates that ethics training makes very little difference at all. So I started asking the question, well, what's actually going on here? And from my perspective, I could understand why bad people did bad things, but I couldn't understand why good people did bad things. So how does somebody with a good character, good family, all that sort of stuff, end up creating bad outcomes? Insider trading, fraud, any of those sorts of things, where they end up in jail. And so I looked at the interdisciplinary theory. It's hard to say, interdisciplinary theory. So interdisciplinary theory is theory across different disciplines. So I looked at not only moral philosophy and business ethics, but also social psychology, criminology and neurocognitive science. And I developed a causal factor model explaining why people do bad things, and came up with a underlying normative ethical theory called moral intention theory. And so my proposal to you and to everybody else is that if you want to act ethically, what you need to do is establish what your intent is, intention or intent. In other words, what you're trying to create, what your values are, etc. And then enact that intent and protect it from flawed justifications. So there's only 7 flawed justifications. So flawed justifications basically allow people to do bad things without having to assess themselves as being bad. And it's worthwhile to be aware of that and to be able to circle back around and understand, I suppose, what the traps are really, because you can be deluded into thinking that you're not doing a bad thing when actually you are. So it's a good check, and so that's moral intention theory. And then in the last podcast, so podcast number 6, we looked at examples. So I took you through a couple of examples of how good people get caught up doing bad things and what the implications of that are. And then, of course, now we're up to podcast number 7. So that's a brief, I suppose, summary of where we've gone so far. And I'm not going to say too much more with this, but what I would really suggest you do at this point, if you haven't already done so, is to go back through and answer some of those questions that I've just drawn your attention to. Right? So go back through and just make sure that you've answered those questions, and you're basically ready to do the next podcast. So the next podcast is, okay, all right, okay, get all that, worked out my vision, worked out my values and stuff like that, kind of get some of the theory behind ethics and that, but how do you actually do it? So that's what we're going to look at next time. All right. So I'm going to leave it there. Like I said, there's a little short podcast this week, but like I said, take the time to go and address those questions. You can also, again, just to bring to your attention, so the Sacred Path School, there's a LinkedIn page if you're in LinkedIn, there's a Facebook page if you're on Facebook, and YouTube channel. This podcast, the video of this podcast with the slides gets uploaded to the YouTube channel, and the audio gets uploaded to Buzzsprout, and also, which is an RSS feed, I don't know how this stuff works, but anyway, and also to Apple Podcasts. All right, bye for now. I hope you're all well, and look forward to connecting in the next podcast. Aho.